Hello and welcome to the Michael Mamas Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, and we're coming to you from Mount Soma, home of the Sri Someshwara Temple in the mountains of Western North Carolina. Had a few technical difficulties this morning, but it's all straightened out now, so we should be good to go. Today's podcast, it's an interesting one, I think. How we created and sustain our current situation. And the principle we're going to be talking about here doesn't just apply to the global situation, international, what have you, but right down to a one-on-one relationship with another person, or in fact, your relationship with everything. Vedic knowledge is like that, it's transgradient, meaning it goes across the reality gradient, the reality continuum. The most superficial level of life, you're you, I'm me, that's it. Everything is things, and they're all separate. On the deepest level of life, we're all one. It's all unified field of physics. And so in Sanskrit language, any word, God, for example, or flower or anything, it exists transgradiently, has a different meaning on each level. All right. So the global mind, the frame, Maharishi Patanjali, karma, perception, and prana. That's basically what it's about and how that relates to everything in life. How we view things, how we view each other, how we view situations. If we get into a conflict or we have a positive relationship with somebody, whatever it is, it's all a matter of how we frame it. It's like how we look at it. What you could say what our relationship with it is like, but it's like we get a notion of the reality, and that reality then puts the thing in a frame, puts the relationship in a frame. It's like you label a person, you define the person, you define the situation. And then as you proceed with that relationship, it's all done in context of the frame. And the more you think about it, the more you work with it, the more you relate to it, the more you enliven the frame. And so at some point, the frame becomes your reality. And the truth and your reality may not correspond very well, And that's done, well, the most important thing right now, the way I'm feeling, is that it has to do with how we relate to other people. Are you with me, Scotty? Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's funny because I was just hearing something else about where people reframing the past to fit a different narrative too that changes kind of the truth of what actually happened too.
Yeah. And you can do that. See, even the frame has different levels of meaning, doesn't it? Because if you're not careful, let's say you get a negative attitude towards somebody, and that's all based on how you framed the relationship or how you frame that person. And then everything that happens, you interpret through the frame, and so it reaffirms the frame. And if we do well, Scotty, like you're saying, if we can just catch ourselves doing that, it helps. Because we can say, oh my God, yeah, there I go again, this happens and it's not working out for me. And I create a frame and I build it up in my mind. Then it becomes something terrible. And it's not even what the reality is, Now, there's a principle that it's all about perception, in the Vedic knowledge, this whole universe is Maya, it's illusion, so it's all built out of mind. There's a cosmic mind, there's a group dynamic mind, what do they call it? Global mind. And that becomes a very, very powerful thing, because the global mind defines a context that you either conform to or you get no support for. And that's true also on all levels. Your interpersonal relationships, there's a kind of like an agreement, a commonality. And you either buy into that or you're an oddball, you know? But now, Patanjali also talked about some skaras. You see, we have our mind, and what is our mind? Our mind is a combination of two things. And both of them can be viewed as, if you want to get spiritual about it, God's will. God's will then comes in two forms. Karma, on the one hand, cause and effect. From the perspective of pure karma, your thoughts are not really your thoughts. They're a result of the sum total of interactions that have affected your awareness from day one. It's a little bit like if the universe was a billiard table and you roll a bunch of balls on the billiard table. If you knew all the physics, the spin on the balls, the velocity of the balls, the elasticity of the cushions, the friction of the felt, you could calculate exactly, you could predict exactly at each point in time where each ball was going to be. And then they'd finally come to rest, and you could predict all of that. Now, from the karmic perspective, this world is just a big, huge billiard table. And all the electrons, protons, everything that goes into constructing your mind, your thoughts, it's all a function. It's predetermined based upon the angular momentum, speed, blah, 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 of all the particles in existence, be they subatomic particle or what have you, be they physiological, anatomical, what have you. All those contribute then karmically to what you think. And that's called predetermination. This has all been predetermined from that perspective. And so mind is created out of karma, but also, as Vedic literature says, there's another component. And that other component is prana. Now, typically prana is thought of as like pranayama, the breathing on the physical level, and that's true. But again, everything in Sanskrit language exists transgradiently. And on the deepest level, how the universe even manifested is you've got the field of pure consciousness, pure existence. Consciousness before it was even conscious of any of this, because none of this even existed. And consciousness becomes conscious of itself, perceives it as other. Two things are born. Then comes over those two things, three things, then it cascades out into infinity. And that's a self-interacting dynamic within the field of no thingness itself, pure isness itself. But what happens, really quite interesting, is that the awareness becomes enraptured by the beauty and the complexity, the profundity of the world that gets created from that self-interacting dynamic. You see? And from that level, it's a field of infinite freedom, because the identity hasn't been lost to that dynamic. It's still functioning within the field of oneness. And it starts to breathe. It takes on a life. And that life then wells up and emerges through relativity. And that's the field of free will. No limitation, no identity with anything that's perceived. The identity starts after it gets into relativity. That's why they call it relativity, because it's how we view this world as relative to our identity, how we hold it, how we view it, how we frame it. Am I making sense there, Scotty?
Yeah. A question is also how is it that the chit is involved in shaping how your limitations are or
Right. Yeah,
your ability
we'll
to
talk
move
about
through.
that.
Yeah.
The chit, yeah. So Maharishi Patanjali talks about uh, the nature of the mind. There's something called the chit. The chit is the storehouse of impressions. Once those perceptions become etched into the, and it's a physiological thing, etched into the awareness, then it programs the mind to frame all of existence in a certain way. And so as those impressions get stronger, the chit gets stronger. And the impressions start to become like etched in steel or in concrete. But as we evolve, that chit starts to soften. It becomes like clay, and you can put an etching in it, but it rubs out pretty easily. It can become like a gelatin, where over a very short period of time, it just goes back naturally. And then eventually water, and then air, and then that's called freedom, because then you're functioning from a place of free will. It's not a programming of the awareness. That's the idea. It's not based on karma. And so that's why they say, and that's why they say in an enlightened state, you have no mind. And it's funny what's been done with that in Zen Buddhism and different places. The idea of no mind. Oh, I have no mind. I have no mind. No, it's a physiological thing. It's a state of the physiology of the chit where it's become just no longer a storehouse. You see?
Yeah, you're able to move through all of these things without getting stuck on any one of the things.
Yeah, you don't get lost, you don't get stuck, you don't get identified with the frame, how you frame things. But the world today, it's so established. Everybody, every individual, it seems, takes sides, takes a frame and believes in that frame and re-enlivens that frame and reinforces that frame in their group consciousness that are formed. Democrats versus Republicans, for example, each has their own frame, how they frame things, and they hang on to that, and that becomes truth to them. And they can't really understand the other frame. They just think it's not just another frame to them, it's just plain wrong. So you see, when we talk about world peace, for example, when we talk about enlightening the world, when we talk about a golden age, it's not about getting everybody to agree to a certain kind of frame that's all love and light or what have you. And let's just all cling to that. And then we're living in an enlightened age. No, that's just another set of impressions, another identity, another limitation of the awareness. So we're talking about, if you will, the physiology of global consciousness, the physiology of the global mind, which is, of course, subdivided into nations, communities, individuals. That's why when we look at uh, a particular person, I can view that person one way, you can view them a completely different way. You might think they're the world's greatest person in the world, and I might think, well, I don't know. It's all about the frame. So there, in that sense, there's no communion. There's no communication, not really, because anything that's outside of how we've latched onto that frame is, from our perspective, based on our reality, if you will, it's just plain wrong. That's what we're dealing with. And so evolving the world, what does that have to do? That means evolving the chit of the awareness of the whole globe, if you will. And that's what will bring world peace, because then you're functioning in harmony with prana, life breath, the breath of the absolute, the breath of Chaitanya, the breath of the unified field, which is a source of infinite harmony, infinite coherence, uh, unity of diversity, you see. understanding. That's why we tend to put the Chaitanya at the base. Somebody once asked me, why don't shouldn't it be up above? Well, that's actually an interesting question, which would get us in a very different direction. I can say it briefly. Again, I like it at the base because it's the foundation. It's like the roots of a tree rooting into Mother Earth, But now the physiology, there's a tangent here, but the physiology is structured in a different way. It's just a physiological thing based on how our chakras are, really. And that is that the spiritual centers are up here, and then we go through, emotions and different levels of our being through the different chakra system. And so the spiritual level, when we open to spirituality, heaven above, and there's a reality to that, again, on a particular level, based largely on physiology. And it's physiology not just of individuals, though that's certainly there with the chakra system. It also has to do with the physiology of the globe, Mother Earth, heaven above, that kind of a thing. Anyway, that was a little tangential, but I think good to know. It actually gets very interesting because we're talking about framing. And now there's a field of Vedic knowledge called Sthapatya. And they normally refer to it as Vastu. Vastu is really the whole study of how to frame things, how things are framed. The word Vastu itself means fence. It means defining a space. And so the art of architecture, which is within the domain of Vastu science, is all about how to create a structure and even the fence around the structure that frames things in a manner that is in harmony with nature. Also, there's a whole thing in mathematics, which is, in the sense we're talking now, a function of Vastu science, and it's called set theory. Set theory is like an expression, a correlate to the very manifestation of existence itself. All there is pure no-thingness, pure consciousness. Consciousness before there was anything in relativity. But now consciousness, by its nature, becomes consciousness of itself, sees it as other, and two things are born. Now, in set theory, there's the null set, just that field of no thingness, represented by a zero with a diagonal line across it. And then there's the set containing consciousness. In other words, there's a difference between an apple and a set containing the apple. Once you conceptualize the apple as a set, you can have a set of two apples. You can have a set containing one apple. You could have a set containing the null set. Null set, pure consciousness. The set containing the null set, consciousness aware of itself, puts it in a box, frames it. And then that just cascades out. Now you have those two things. You can create another set, consciousness aware of those two things, the null set and the set containing the null set inside those two things is inside of the third set now. And that just goes, so it's all set theory, which structures relativity. That's the manifestation of existence. So you see, everything in life, it's all about how things are framed. We don't perceive. We perceive onto, we project onto. It's how relativity works. That's why it's called relativity. So even when you're enlightened, you're functioning in the field of projection, yet now rooted in the field of oneness. functioning in the field of projection while rooted in the field of clear perception. And what happens when you get enlightened, then you awaken to that perceiver. Call it the witness. No opinion, no framing, no perspective, just pure consciousness. Just holds and witnesses in its infinite wisdom, harmony, coherence, understanding of everything, holds everything. And then in this state of enlightenment, that's not a notion. It's not something you can kind of imagine. It's just the state of physiology, state of your physiology. You know? Does that make sense, Scotty?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's set theory. Now there's another really cool thing I got to talk about. Field theory. Maybe I think most people have heard the expression field theory, right, Scotty?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah, field theory. Okay, what is field theory? Because it's beautiful and it so applies to how we function as individuals. A field is like, let's say, a set of all positive integers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Wouldn't include a negative one because that's a negative integer. And we're just talking about a field containing a set of all positive integers. Within that field, there are certain operations that can occur. 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, 1 and 1 are both in that field. 2 is in that field. So that's an operation that functions in that field. 1 - 2. Well, wait a minute. 1 - 2 is a -1. That doesn't exist in that field. And what happens then is our awareness gets structured based on our level of consciousness. Our whole awareness is a function or founded upon functioning within a particular field. And we can't see past that field. We may function in a field that just rejects the notion of negative integers, only positive integers. But now if that's the case, if we take 1 and divide it by 2, well, that's 1/2, and that doesn't exist in our world. So we reject it. It's bogus. We just can't believe it. We don't accept it. It's just wrong. And so what happens is as we evolve, our field expands. And that's in a nutshell, in a very simplistic way, the notion of field theory, but it gets very, very interesting because they start exploring fields that are just unimaginable, really. For example, square root. What times itself equals, so the square root of 4 is what? 2, because 2 times 2 = 4. What's the square root of a -1? Well, anything times itself is a positive number. So let's see, the square root of -1 then doesn't exist even within the field of what we call real numbers. 1/2, 1/3, -1/2, -1/3 doesn't exist. But there's a whole universe called complex variable analysis that builds a whole universe that accommodates and allows for the square root of -1. But now the interesting thing is that actually has applications in our physical universe. Electromagnetics, which everything's electromagnetic, this table, this microphone, your body. I mean, this is largely an electromagnetic universe, electrons, protons, neutrons. And so it pretty much addresses everything. And that's just one example of the vastness of the field, the potentiality of field theory, the nature of the unified field. The unified field is a field that holds all possibilities, all possibilities. If you want to use the word miracles, that's what miracles come from. It's functioning within a field that is beyond what the perceiver's consciousness can believe. It's magic. It's impossible. And many of the stories of, gurus, enlightened people who live in the forest and do all these incredible things, they just have opened to a much greater field than most people. And see, what we're doing here at Mount Sommer, we're building a unified field generator laid out by these great rishis, enlightened seers. They explain how to build something that frees the limitation of human awareness. It radiates that value out to all the environment. It evolves the environment. It doesn't tell people what to think. It frees their awareness so that they can think in a more expanded way, have deeper insight, can accommodate more of the nature of life and existence at its deeper levels, which are unified, a source of infinite harmony, intelligence, and wisdom. But what happens? People hear about that. Oh, that's too far-fetched, doesn't fit. They wouldn't say it this way, but it doesn't fit in my field of understanding, so it can't be true. But it is true. And it's really interesting because even people that are really dedicated to, Vedic science or what have you, they can still have a hard time imagining that you can build a unified field generator, is what we call it, that can purify the global consciousness to a point where it brings peace on earth, health, prosperity, abundance. If we just didn't do all the stupid things we do as human beings, everybody'd be living like a billionaire right now and better. All the money and all the effort we put into wars, conflict, disagreements, arguing. Imagine if all that energy was harmonized and unified and contributed to the growth of humanity and the world. Instead of even when we have a small field, a small window, that how we frame things, and we want to say, if everybody just thought the way I did, the world would be fine. Why doesn't everybody else frame it like I do? And then we would have peace on earth. No. Peace on earth, real peace on earth, that comes from a field of unified field, not from a notion of what it means to be unified based on our limited perspective. It's just so ridiculous, really. It's a contradiction, Now, there's one beautiful thing here I'd like to mention, certainly before we go, and that is that your gift is also your challenge. And I think I like a lot of people. Well, first of all, when you fall in love, anybody, when you fall in love, what is that really? That means you're seeing that person on deeper level, to that point where you're one with that person. You feel unified with that person. You see the place deep within that person where they're one with a unified field. It's a field of perfection. That's called love. But to varying degrees, some of us more than others, we tend to see that or sense that to a greater degree, perhaps. Or maybe we all do. But then when you meet somebody and you get to know somebody, even if it's just a superficial relationship or a brief relationship, somebody at the checkout counter at the grocery store. And what you do is you spontaneously see the good in that person, spontaneously feel the divinity in that person. You believe in that person on some fundamental level. And that's a gift. But at the same time, your gift becomes your challenge, because what happens then is, even though you see, yeah, well, they did this or they act this way, or gee, that's not really good, but I still see the divinity in them. I get it. It's okay. What happens then is it becomes your challenge, because even though you see it, even though you saw it, you can't help but to gravitate towards their divinity. It's like, if I just have a good relationship with them, if I'm just good to them, then they won't function from that negative place. They'll function from that place of divinity within themselves. And so that becomes a challenge, because you keep getting hit up against the side of your head, Scotty?
Yeah, no, I'm just laughing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So when two people love each other, and it takes work. Why? Because even when two people are in love, there's a whole global consciousness there. There's a whole way of framing things that has a great deal of negativity in it in this day and age. But if people are in love, really, two people are really in love, and if they can hold that in a way, frame that in a way that remains untainted, even though they may watch the news at night and say how horrible the world is or something, the communion between those two is the main thing. It's strong. And that can be even within a family or what have you. I know my teacher once said that an ideal marriage, a marriage like that, is enough to bring the two people all the way through enlightenment to God realization, even if they didn't meditate. Now, it doesn't mean they shouldn't meditate, but it just shows the power of communion, real communion. In most communion, it's we don't want to say that anybody who's in love, that's where they're functioning from all the time. Of course not. But if two people would, if they could even be committed to that, and within a family dynamic, it's called understanding, So your gift is your challenge. You can see at the end of the notes for this podcast, after the dotted lines, dashes, there's some stuff about the world affairs today, and that I don't think we'll get into that right now. But I'd like to end with a reference to Willie Nelson. I really like Willie Nelson's music. His guitar is incredible, how he plays, At any rate, my favorite Willie Nelson song, even though I like a lot of his songs, my favorite Willie Nelson song is Angel Flying Too Close to the Ground. You can go to YouTube, and there's one where it has that with lyrics. I like that because the words are good, But in a way, Scotty, I guess that's what we were just talking about love, about understanding, and about living in a world where there's so much negativity and grief. And how in the song, one holds another person in that sort of environment. So go to YouTube, and it's a beautiful song. And I think it has a lot of meaning for a lot of us, all of us probably. All right, Scotty, I guess that's it, huh?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things, but yeah, it's a lot for today.
Yeah, I think that's probably enough, huh? It's looking like next week we're going to have a guest that's going to interview me, and we'll see how that unfolds, what that evolves into. Scotty will, of course, remain in the AV room, the virtual AV room, and he's running all the background and everything, and we'll see how it goes. So thanks for listening. We'll talk with you again next week on Ancient Secrets Revealed. Thanks for listening.